And we are live. Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar hosted by Hello Tomorrow and Traitomic, where we'll be discussing everything related to trait modification in crops. What are trait modifications? What does that imply for companies and for startups? What do regulations have to do with that? How does that impact everyday business? We'll have a quick look at this throughout the next hour. It's 2:01, so we'll wait maybe just, let's say, 1 minute for people to arrive, and then we'll jump right in with our panelists today. All right, everyone. So welcome again. Just to give you a little bit of a rundown in terms of the actually application and Livestorm, how it works. So I have the panelists with me. I'll give a brief introduction right after that. We have about 50 minutes of presentation and talks. After that, there is a dedicated Q&A section that we would love to be able to have with the participants. On the bottom right, you have a questions tab as well as a chat tab. So please feel free to put in your questions in that tab and to upvote the question that you would really like to be answered by our panelists today. Before we start off this conversation, we wanted to give you a very, very brief introduction of Hello Tomorrow, who we are and where we're coming from. We've been around for at least over a decade now, and our goal is to bring innovations from lab to market, what we mostly refer to as deep tech or emerging technologies. Our goal is to connect a global ecosystem to solve what we call planetary and human health and our biggest challenges today. Our main focus is impact, like I was saying, human and planetary health to create a sustainable growth for hopefully a better world. We do that through a number of ways, but we have 4 main pillars. The first one is actually to scout deep tech, so emerging technologies, these solutions worldwide through startup competitions, notably our global challenge that has just finished. Building a collaborative ecosystem that goes mostly through events, as well as the way in which we would enable ecosystems with investors, corporations, startups, research centers, accelerators. Innovation consulting and services to spearhead new technologies and collaborations, as well as Deep Tech Observatory, which is our thought leadership. We've been doing that for the past 10 years, and we are very excited to be able to showcase new solutions and technologies in a broad range of sectors, which is also why we are here today. So it is my pleasure to welcome our panelists today. With me, I have Tony Fynd, co-founder and head of technology development at Traitomic, a startup from Carlsberg focusing on non-genetically modified trait development in crops and microbes. Debbie Yaver, chief science officer at Nature's Fynd, a company that develops microbe-based proteins for meat substitutes and dairy substitutes, as well as Katja Merton-Lenz, managing partner at Food Law Science and Partners, a niche law firm created in 2021 and fully dedicated to food innovation, accompanying food business operators from A to Z. So to start things off, I would actually love to have a brief definition and overview of what trait development is and what it currently means. Tony, what do you think about this? Could you take it away for us?
Great, thanks, Chloe. So I'm going to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about traits, trait development, and trait development tools. And just to start off with, as Chloe was asking, what are traits? So traits in principle are genetically determined characteristics of any organism. And good traits have the potential to increase the quality and value of the food and food ingredients that we want as consumers, but that we also want to produce. And traits can have a really broad impact across different foods and different food products. And that impact can go all the way from supporting food security. We know we need to produce more food. We know that the raw materials that we are growing and the strains that we are growing are under pressure by biotic and abiotic stresses. And traits can help us to adapt our organisms better to cope with these stresses in the future. This can go all the way towards quality traits that's very much driven by nutrition and by flavor. We know there's certain nutritional compounds that we really, really like in our products, and certain genes and pathways that underpin these nutritional compositions can be boosted through traits and specific genes. But conversely, we also know of anti-nutritional compounds, and I think it's a very important aspect of the work that trait developers do is to identify what are the anti-nutritional compounds that prevent us to consume healthier food in the future and take them out of our food production system. And an area that I'm very excited about is the processing. How can we positively influence processing through traits and through genes? We know we want to produce our food more sustainable in the future. And we can actually use traits and specific genes to help us produce our food in a more sustainable way by looking really at our water and energy consumption. In order to do all these things, we need tools. And just to have a little bit of a look at tools that enable us to work with genetic variation, and genetic variation ultimately underpinning traits. And this toolbox is very broad. This is just a generalization of the different tools that we have available today. We are, of course, coming from centuries of trait development. We've been doing this for thousands of years, that we're adapting our raw materials, that we're adapting our strains. Now we have a really comprehensive toolbox, and that goes from phenotypic selection, where we really look at natural variants, exotic cultures, biochemical screens. How can we identify beneficial phenotypes that actually drive the improvements in the traits that we're interested in? Equally relevant genetic selection. Here, we have a broad range of tools available that goes from using really smart genetic screens by using natural and induced genetic variation, all the way to machine learning and complex complex sequencing applications to do genomic predictions of breeding value. And then, of course, we have emerging tools like gene editing, very much spearheaded by CRISPR nucleases, but in general, custom nucleases that allow us to modify specific locations and specific genomes, but also all the way to transgenic techniques that allow trait developers to move valuable genes from one species into another. And I think what we really want to bring across here is that we have a toolbox available to the trait developer. And today, more so than at any other point, these enabling technologies are not necessarily a bottleneck anymore. We have a good toolbox, and now it's the question, which tool do we use to develop what type of trait? And in order to do that, we have some strategic considerations that we're looking at. When we talk to our industry partners, when we look to academic partners, every trait presents almost its own bottleneck, and which tool you use is very much dependent on the trait and the organism that you're working with. Just to give you a little bit of insights on that, what we're talking about at industry level, here, IP landscape, extremely important. If we're looking at the legal framework that we need to operate under in order to develop a commercial product, that is very complex, and people want legal clarity. Here, a term that we always use is freedom to operate. We need clarity on the freedom to operate on the technologies that we want to use, but also on the traits that we want to actually develop. Then we have regulatory and consumer acceptance, and Katja will talk a bit more about this. But here we basically look at a framework that is not unified yet globally. We have different regulatory frameworks in different countries. You need to pick based on the trait that you're developing, what kind of tool am I going to use and what kind of geographic location I'm in. This regulatory framework can become practically very complex as well. If you have a globally operating company with a global supply chain, this is exactly what you want to be looking at. You need to move your raw materials, your strains, your products all around the world. If you have different jurisdictions with different regulatory frameworks, this suddenly becomes very complex, and you want to take this into consideration when you pick your tools. Then speed and specificity. Especially if you are in the product development scope, it's speed to market. You want to be on the shelf first. It's something that people are really looking at. What is the development cycle? Not just from an R&D point of view, but also that commercial product and the commercialization pipeline afterwards. we need tools that are fast. We need also tools that are fast in the R&D space because we want to fail fast. We need to find out when do we get it wrong. So we are really choosing techniques as well that give us that pace in our development pipeline. Specificity is becoming more and more important. We have now in the genetic selection space, high throughput sequencing really enabled us to make some really qualified decisions when it comes to trait development. We have so much information now. We know the pathways we're interested in. We know the genes that are underpinning specific traits. We need to have tools that allow us to specifically select the genetic variation that we actually want in our commercialization process. And finally, applicability. And I think this is really important. I think we are living in a time where we want to diversify as well when it comes to the food and food products that we are looking at. And that becomes part of your decision-making process. If you want to use a tool in an organism that is non-transformable, you cannot use technologies that require that transformation step. Then you need to be looking at conventional breeding techniques that would allow you to make that step forward. So applicability is very important. Do certain techniques actually work in the organism that I'm interested in? And here we, of course, see a strength towards the conventional breeding techniques that are largely based on the concepts of evolution. And this type of applicability, we work very broadly in different plants and different microbes, but I think you're going to see an example now as well, where we're talking about extremophiles, organisms that are very new, that are inherently under-resourced from a studying point of view. So what kind of tools can we use in order to improve these kind of organisms? And I think Debbie is going to talk a little bit more about these kind of exciting organisms in the next few minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Debbie, could you please tell us a little bit more about how trait development resonates within Nature's Fynd in your current position?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks, Tony, for the great introduction, because it's a good introduction. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about Nature's Fynd, what we do, how we do it, and the importance, right, of trait development to really, for the field of using microbes to produce food or a food ingredient. Why it's important to us. So Nature's Fynd actually started, our origins actually are here in Montana, where I happen to be sitting today. It was isolated, the organism was isolated from Yellowstone National Park. It was part of work that was funded by NASA. NASA was interested in understanding what are the living organisms, microorganisms in these extreme ecosystems. And the organism was isolated from a geothermal acidic spring in Yellowstone, and then it was of course sequenced to determine the identity of the organism. This organism is a filamentous fungi. It's part of the Fusarium genus, and we have named it the Fusarium strain Flavolapis. This organism has very unique capabilities. It can grow in very extreme pH environments, everything from pH down to pH 2 up to pH 10. The ability to grow at low pH is an industrial advantage because when you can grow at a low pH, you can actually reduce the issues of contamination, which of course, when you're at scale, large scale can be an issue. It also presents some potential challenges because the organism was found in a very extreme environment. So the types of tools you would use, like UV mutagenesis and chemical mutagenesis, they're inherently a little bit, they're able to survive some of the normal conditions. So you have to adjust the conditions for extremophiles. We have also developed a breakthrough way that we produce this ingredient. So the ingredient we produce is the whole biomass, the whole fungi. And what's shown here on the left is what it looks like after production. It's a mat. It almost looks like a dough. And we've developed a new method to produce it in this format. The ingredient is very nutrient dense. It's very high in protein, typically over 50% protein. It's high in fiber also, including insoluble fibers, which have health benefits. From an amino acid profile, it's a complete protein, and it's high in branched chain amino acids, which also has a nutritional benefit. The important thing you'll see here at the top is it's non-GMO. So given that it's food and it's eaten, given the current regulations around the world, we're very focused on, we have to keep our organism, non-GM. It also has really nice mouthfeel. But as you can imagine, when you're talking about making a food ingredient, you have to be thinking about things, and Tony mentioned this earlier, color, right? You have to be thinking about flavor. You have to be thinking about cost of production. And that's where the ability to be able to alter the organism, to change some of those traits is important. Phy, as an ingredient, that's what we call the biomass, Phy. It's very versatile. So we can use it to make many different dairy alternatives, as well as meat alternatives. We can also use it to make baked goods as a flour for baked goods. In this picture, these are all products that actually have been made using Phy. We can use it to make condiments, a replacement for mayonnaise and for salad dressings and such. So it's very versatile. These are the two products we have on the market. So we have approval to sell in the US, 2 cream cheeses and 2 meatless breakfast patties. We also have approval in a couple other countries, and we're working to get approval in the European Union through EFSA right now. From a sustainability point of view, having the ability to produce protein from using a microbe has a real positive benefit. It uses 99% less land, 99% less water, and you have 94% fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to, for instance, beef. So this is something that, as a world citizens, right, we should care about the ability to be able to produce these sorts of products. Then I wanted to just end to give you some examples of traits, right, that we might go after, right, and we want to do it in a non-GM way, as I said, but in the future, I'm hoping, like others perhaps, right, that we're going to see some changes in the regulatory, and we'll be able to use perhaps GM approaches down the road. But for us, when we look at traits, one of the important things for a food ingredient, as I mentioned, color, we want it to be neutral or white so that it can be formulated in a number of different products. As you can imagine, if it's red or purple or whatever, consumers, when they see food, their impression of it is not just flavor, but it comes from what they see also, as well as the texture. So flavor, texture, color. Also, we want to be able to produce this at a cost that allows us to be on cost parity with dairy, right, and meat products, which means cost is important in production. So we want to be able to take in a fermentation to convert as much of the carbon that we're putting into that fermenter to the ingredient as possible. And of course, microorganisms make a lot of other compounds that may not be of interest, or even unwanted metabolites. And having a trait where you've removed that somehow, the ability to produce that, is another good example of things that you might want to do. As Tony mentioned, speed is very important in industry, and for us, it's also very important, as well as IP. So all those things go into consideration as we're choosing what sort of path and tool we use to change a trait in production. I will end there and pass it back to Chloe. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Debbie. It's very interesting to see the different types of traits, or different traits, period, that you're actually looking into, and seeing that not only you're striving for impact, but you also already have substantial impact with Phy. So it's very inspiring. Thank you so much. I'll move on with another topic. So recently, the EU has actually created a new proposal related to new genomic techniques. And I would love to have a little bit more context and highlighting the way in which this will impact the future. So Katja, would it be possible for you to move
I'm
on?
here.
Perfect.
Possible for sure, but I'm afraid I will be very less interesting, not to say boring, compared with Debbie and Tony. I will do my best to keep the attendees awake. So it's so challenging to try to sum up or to provide you in a nutshell with the EU background and current situation. So just a definition, because I'm a lawyer, I'm on the legal side, so I need to be bipolar. You see A, B, and always on the left and on the right side. More seriously, yes, new genomic techniques constitute a diverse group of techniques that can be used to change the genome, such as, for us, generally speaking, mutagenesis, intragenesis, and cisgenesis, the famous CRISPR. And for new breeding techniques, these are the NGTs applied to plant breeding, the topic of today. A very important point to focus on, because everything is around this difference, is NBTs, NGTs versus GMOs. Why? Because both GMOs and NGTs, NBTs modify the genome of an organism. But we all know that there is always a but. Actually, there are 3 buts. GMOs are organisms in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally. This is very important. Second but or reservation, a GMO authorizes the introduction of an external gene into a seed, while NBTs make it possible, but not systematic, to modify a genome without introducing a foreign gene. So, how to say, in other words, the European legislation is a bit, or was a long time a bit confused regarding NBTs, NGTs versus GMOs, and makes no specific provision for NGTs, and even worse than that, often refers to those technologies that have been developed after the adoption of GMO, like it was before and after the GMO's legal framework, which is not very pertinent and very useful for food business operators in this area. What is the EU legal background? You might know, may know, and just to sum up, the legal basis of GMOs is a mandatory and very difficult, very strict one, which implies that there is a consent, a scientific assessment of the risks, and a mandatory authorization with some possible standstill clause of each member state. And we know has how much France, for instance, Germany, and even Italy or Belgium are really reluctant to accept an authorized GMO on their national territory. And really, and I'm used to working with GMOs. Sorry, I heard something. No, I'm used to working with GMOs issues regarding labeling, and anyway, even today, the normal consumer, the man in the street, is really scary, frightened regarding GMO, considering that it is new, so it is necessarily dangerous. This is the spirit of our consumers, of our European citizens. The European legal background, we cannot bypass the first ruling of the European Court of Justice. It was in 2018. It followed a request from the French Conseil d'État, so the French High Court, the French Council, asked by a French association to assess the the state of play, the rules applicable to mutagenesis. At this occasion, the European Court of Justice, it was at the time a very important ruling, ruled that organisms obtained by mutagenesis are, in fact, genetically modified organisms, which has, as a consequence, they have to follow all the GMO's rules, which again constitutes a lot of constraints. But it was a very confusing ruling because at the same time, in the same decision, the court mentioned that organisms obtained by means of techniques, methods of mutagenesis, which have conventionally been used in a number of applications and have a long safety record, are excluded from the scope of that directive. So the court left open many questions, such as what does the court mean by conventional use, by a number of applications, or even by a long safety record. So based on this 2018 ruling, we have a statement: mutagenesis has to follow GMO's framework, but, and a big but, some, not to say many, mutagenesis could be excluded from the scope of GMOs. 2023, second round, the European Court of Justice made a huge step, literally a reversal in its opinion, by concluding this time that plants obtained by random mutagenesis in vitro are not considered GMOs. Therefore, now, since 2023, based on this European Court of Justice new ruling, both in vivo and in vitro random mutagenesis are now excluded from the scope of the GMO regulation. Is it necessary to mention and to point out that, yes, definitely the European Commission was expected, but even since 2018, to make a proposal aimed at regulating NGTs to provide the food business operators with a clear and some useful guidelines, and not such a mess in the approach, with a confusion between GMOs and some kind of traits and NGTs and NBTs. Where do we stand now? Yes, we've got it. We have a proposal from the European Commission. Just to go a little backwards, it was in 2021, so just in the middle of the road between the two rulings from the European Court of Justice. The European Commission opened the debate over the regulatory status of NGTs and concluded that new policy instruments should be considered. Wow, such a surprise. Which is of more interest is more precisely what were its conclusions. And I just picked and chose three, which in my opinion are of high interest. For the European Commission realized at the time, based on the study, of course, that there are NGTs products that do not contain any foreign genetic material. So we cannot systematically compare and assimilate GMOs and NGTs. First statement, or first conclusion. Second one, similar products with similar risk profiles can be obtained with conventional breeding techniques, because certain genome editing techniques and cisgenesis. Very important as well. Lastly, NGTs can contribute to a stronger and more sustainable food system. And you would remember that the word in the adjective sustainable is in every mouth now. We need to have everything sustainable, and sustainability is really our reference. So this one is a strong conclusion. So it means, in other words, that since 2021, the Commission realized or has announced indirectly that they have to be somehow in favor to NGTs and NBTs, because NGTs can contribute to a stronger and more sustainable food system. July this year, 2023, the Commission presented its proposal for a regulation on plants obtained by certain new genomic techniques and their food and feed only, and amending regulation 2017/625. This one is a regulation about official controls, which is already a very heavy one. And yes, the Commission didn't decide to really tailor-made from scratch regulation only for NGTs, NBTs, but chose to introduce and review an existing regulation, so the regulation about official controls. This proposal, in my humble opinion, is really, smart and interesting. This proposal creates two categories of NGTs. What about, and more precisely, these two categories of NGTs? First category, NGTs that could also occur naturally or be produced by conventional breeding techniques and their progeny obtained by conventional breeding techniques. It means that if we crossed the study from the European Commission, the conclusion of the study from the European Commission and the ruling of the Court of Justice, the main point or the main issue is always regarding safety. But for category 1, the European Commission considered and identified NGTs which are absolutely not dangerous because we are in an environment we know. It means that these NGT plants could occur naturally. It's like nature and they need to be treated alike. So very logically, category 1 will not be of any danger, not harmful for consumers. It will go differently for category 2. Category 2 will cover all NGT plants which are not which are not into category 1, but more precisely all NGT plants that should remain subject to the requirements of the GMO legislation. Why? Because they feature more complex sets of modification to the genome. Again, and indirectly, even if it's not said, for the European Commission, all these NGTs plants which will be included into category 2 could potentially be dangerous. So they absolutely need to follow a risk assessment and to be more carefully assessed. What about the procedure regarding category 1? The European Commission has decided to innovate with a sort of legal classification. It means that NBTs, which are deemed equivalent to plants that have occurred naturally or have been produced by conventional breeding techniques, have a risk comparable to those in the nature. So they should be treated alike, meaning that GMO regulation will not be applicable to them. No other specific rules will be applicable to this category 1. But any other, general rules or framework applicable to conventionally bred plants will be applicable. I just mentioned novel food, but it could be many other things. So it means category 1 is like anything else. It's usual. There are nothing really dangerous to point out. So go your way. It's pretty normal, business as usual. Category 1, just to finish on this, to make sure that you are under category 1, it is not only, as it could be for novel food, for instance, on the shoulders on the food business operator to assess on his own if he is under category 1 or 2. No, this time the Commission would like to be really involved, and so they suggested a verification procedure. It means that the obtention of a declaration of category 1 will be as follows: a submission of a verification request, including a detailed description and proofs that the organism fits with all the criteria set in an annex, the transmission of the request from the national competent authority to the Commission, that will also be EFSA, which will rule upon the admissibility of the request. 45 days after the Commission should have the draft decision declaring whether or not the NGT plant is classified as category 1. So it is not really heavy as a procedure, but again, the food business operator is not totally free to decide if he considers that his NBTs is under category 1 or not. So you will have to follow a verification procedure, which is quite new. What about category 2? General rules. The safety need to be assessed. As I mentioned, the NBTs under category 2 are potentially considered or are potentially dangerous. They should remain subject to an authorization in accordance with the legal framework of GMO, so mainly the directive from 2001 and the regulation from 2003. The labeling must be made in accordance, and the amount of information necessary for the risk assessment will vary on a case-by-case basis, given the wide variety of those NGT plans, which were illustrated by Tony and Debbie, just a little. The European Commission in its proposal creates 3 scenarios and procedures related for category 2 NGTs for respectively the deliberate release for any other purpose than for placing on the market. Second scenario, they are placing on the market for products other than food and feed. And third scenario, they are placing on the market for plants for food and feed use and food and feed consisting of produce from category 2 NGT plants, in other words, their progeny. What is next? Because I'm sometimes a bit uncomfy to provide too many details regarding a draft proposal. Generally, it takes more or less 2 to 3 years from the draft proposal to be finalized, to be published, and very often, generally always, it is the final text is really different and far from the proposals initiated by the European Commission. Why? Because the Commission proposition will be examined by, respectively, the European Parliament and the European Council. Upon reading, the Parliament can adopt the proposal with or without amendments. Of course, every time the Parliament adopts many amendments. A draft report from the Envy Committee has already been presented, and the indicative plenary sitting date is next January the 15th. It will take time, they will vote, they will discuss, and on such a kind of a proposal, it's a hot topic, so we can expect hot and long debates. And it's not the end of the procedure. The European Council will then have to approve or amend its turn the Parliament position with the amendments. And just for your information, this time the Council has already presented a compromise text on almost all the articles from 1 to 11 and excluding already Article 5.3. So I would say that given the high sensitivity of the topic, I'm pretty sure that intermediate stages, such as the general approach, trilogues, will likely take place, for sure. And many amendments have to be expected, and as I mentioned, hot and long debates. So the co-decision process usually takes about 2 to 2.5 years, but in this case, it could be even longer. So just thank you, of course, but just to say, it's interesting to follow and to be aware of the content of the European proposal, but you don't have to panic or to adapt your process or to say, oh my God, we need to, to draft already your request to be classified category 1. Take your time, no rush, because the situation can really evolve and things can change. And on top of that, maybe you can intervene, you can influence the Parliament amendments, and so the process of co-decision. Many things are in the hands of the food business operators, and you can so you can have access to the final decision by lobbying. So I'm at your disposal if you have any questions. I try to make this European background and current situation as clear as I can. But again, it is a very detailed and very hot topic, and we are very ahead of the final decision and the final regulation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katja. This was very interesting. And it's usually, you're right, a very complex topic to apprehend. So it's very valuable for us to have you here and to decipher all of this. So thank you so much. So I still understand that there are still some regulatory obstacles. And fortunately, you do have ways to minimize those obstacles, and by using conventional methods and technologies such as Traitomics. So to wrap up the presentations, I would love it if, Tony, maybe you could go ahead with Traitomics technology and give us a little bit more insights on this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chloe. And the great thing is I'm the last one, so I get to sneakily just pick up a few things from Debbie and pick up a few things from Katja and throw this in here as well. And Katja, you were worried it's not going to be as exciting as Debbie's slides, but to me, this is fascinating. This is evolving. And as like Debbie said as well, all the world is looking at us. And to us, this is very important. If you're sitting in that trade development storm, it only shows that everybody believes this is important, this can have an impact, and this situation will change. And I think what comes across nice in all of this is what we want is, as a producer, you want clarity. And as a consumer, you need transparency. And I think this is what it comes down to in the long term. And I think there's a path now. So, but I want to come back to this slide and always want to come back to tools. At the end of the day, we want to do something. We want to have impact. We want to develop traits. And again, we just underpin that there's so many decisions that you can make, what tools you're going to use. I want to exemplify that a little bit by zooming into these two techniques. And we talked about them a little bit because so much has happened. The world is very different now than it was 10 years ago. We're in a great spot when it comes towards trait development. And we're looking back at a decade of major improvements. I think if we're looking at the gene editing space, this is, of course, it's the poster child of development. It's been, over the last 10 years, the rise of CRISPR, before that, starting off with meganuclease, zinc finger nucleases. But it's so obvious for everybody in this field that this improvement over the last 10 years has been rapid, and the people working with these techniques, we understand as well that what it was 10 years ago is not what it's now. It's, of course, there's been massive improvements. I think what is less visible is the improvement on the genetic selection space as well. We have equally dramatic advances in the non-GM trait development space. Here, of course, high throughput sequencing application gives us a lot more information. We have now robotics and great equipment that can just accelerate so many different things. And I think I want to just spend 2 minutes on, so what do you do if we talk about all this complexity, if we strip this back, what choices do you have and where can you work in the genetic selection space that you couldn't work in maybe 10 years ago? And this is where this webinar becomes a little bit sciencey, so bear with me. So I want to talk a little bit about genes and pathways and impact and traits. And what I want to talk about is lupins. As we all know, lupins are great and they're pretty flowers, but they're also high protein crops. And if you're not really into the subjects, lupins are also part of the protein transition. Debbie talked already a little bit about how can we use microbial protein to take a little bit of the animal protein industry, but in the same way we're looking at the plant proteins. And lupins is a little bit in the center of that storm. There's a lot of great protein crops. We're also looking here of geopolitical movements. What are the alternatives to soybean? How can you decentralize that production of that plant protein? So we're looking at locally adapted crops, and lupins is one of these crops. And here, this is a collaboration that we were part of. It's very much led by the University of Copenhagen. And what they've been basically looking at is the nutritional value of these lupins and how you can boost that. Lupins in itself, great proteins, great nutritional value, but they also have some anti-nutritional compounds that we talked about before. Lupins have these compounds called alkaloids. They are protecting the plant, generally speaking. They're super bitter. And these bitter compounds, they're basically restricting the amount of lupins that you can mix into animal feed, or are super extensive in terms of washing off these alkaloids before humans could consume these kind of seeds. So what this collaboration aimed at was basically finding out, okay, what determines what kind of genes are underpinning this trait, switching from sweet lupins to bitter lupins. And the start of that project was a little bit, okay, can we look at different naturally evolved sweet varieties and bitter varieties, compare them, see what is the difference? And it was pretty early, pretty clear that there was one gene, an acetyltransferase, that seemed to be the likely target for that cause between the switch between bitter and sweet. Everything you have a functional version of that gene, and the plant is bitter. Every time you have a non-functional version of that gene, that plant is sweet. So they wanted to, of course, confirm and further utilize that type of trait. But how do you confirm something like this? Basically, over the last 5 years, we come to accept, especially in the R&D space, we use gene editing tools or GM tools to make a proof of concept, grow something in the greenhouse, knock out the gene, and assess it like that. You can't do that in lupins. It doesn't work. It's a non-transformable species. These tools will simply not work. So what do? Do you give up and say, I found a new crop that I get interested in, or you try something else? So in this case, actually, what we've done is we used our Fynd technology in order to develop this trait. So this is a genetic selection technique. The great thing about these techniques is they work in everything. It's based on accelerating evolution through conventional breeding techniques. So we can work in everything, also in lupins. And the principal idea of this technique is that it's a really great screening technique. So you can find very specific nucleotide changes and very specific genes that underpin very specific traits in any plant or microbe without changing the performance of these plants. So what we've done, we've built the world's largest library of lupins. That is a fantastic selection of all the genetic variation that can occur in that genome. And we basically modeled which nucleotide change do you need to identify here that will basically cause a loss of function of that acetyltransferase. So we screened that huge population for exactly that change. And we found a plant where this change had occurred, where you basically have a non-functional version of that particular gene. We gave that back to the university partners, and they basically did impact assessment on that. And what the blue line basically shows is that there's no alkaloids left in these seeds, so there's basically no bitterness, and you have a perfectly sweet cultivar. The great thing about this is that we can look at this differentiated now. We've been basically be able to use conventional breeding techniques in the process. So that means that impact assessment can move even in a difficult regulatory environment like Europe. Out of the greenhouse, you can grow this anywhere in the world. They're able to do impact assessment in a much larger scale and test it under different environments. It's also fantastically fast. Now, what we can do now in this space, we need a 1 seed to seed cycle in lupin that's from April to August to build a library that contains everything. And then you find your genes. So you can really move with elite germplasm. You can pick the best varieties and put that into your trait development program and don't have to use outdated things. And specificity is key in this one because we now have techniques available where we can identify exactly what we planned we would be looking for. We can basically go exactly to the gene that we wanted to identify and pull that out of these libraries. So I think with this, I want to conclude a little bit that I want to show that we have a lot of techniques. Enabling techniques are maybe not the limiting factor anymore. We need to make some smart decisions. What kind of techniques do we need to use for the traits that we want to develop in? And whether it's GM techniques or non-GM techniques in the jurisdictions that we're operating in, we have fantastic tools now that can develop traits fast and in a safe way. And I think it's all about the traits now.
Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you so much, Tony, Debbie, and Katja, for all of those very interesting presentations. I think that we have quite a good overview of what is trait development, what we use it for, and what are the main obstacles that we currently have to embrace it fully. So it is 2:50 at least local time here. So sorry, Debbie, I know that you're based in the US. It's quite early for you. Thank you again for joining so early. Like I mentioned at the very beginning of the session, on the bottom right, you have a questions tab. So please feel free to ask any questions that you may have, and I'll select the ones that Tony, Debbie, and Katja will be able to actually answer. So I see that we had a few related to Phy. So thank you so much, Debbie, for starting to answer those. So yes, Phy is considered a novel food in the EU, and it needs approval. It's currently ongoing. I had a question, I think, from Ariane to Katja. So Katja, we're currently waiting for the amendment approval of the CE proposal. And so what is the current regulatory status of NGT? Are they considered GMOs if they are not issued from random mutagenesis? I see a shrug.
Yeah, we are still in the gray zone. So yes, I know we can use a draft proposal as a sort of guidance, and you can make on your own the classification between category 1 and category 2, even if it's not, mandatory, if it's not a legal and constrained reference. But yes, we can use it anyway until the very first day of the publication of a regulation. You do not have any constraint rules. So we are still in the dark, like we were since 2018 and 2023 with the strange and weird ruling from the Open Court of Justice. I'm sorry. So it's a case-by-case assessment, saying no, we are very different from GMOs. We are like it can occur in the nature, something like that, in terms of risk assessment.
Yes, but so it will evolve. We just need to do that on a case-by-case basis, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but it means you still have a sort of room, and you can, navigate through the marasm. But you can find a way to convince that based on your own risk assessment, you consider that you are on the safe side and not on the GMOs one.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katja.
Welcome.
I see that I had another question. So this time after Tony's presentation related to Traitomic. Gabriel was asking, Tony, can you describe how fast you are able to develop these traits?
Excellent question. Very fast. This is the key message that was supposed to come through as well. I think speed, as Debbie said, speed is at the essence. We develop these techniques really, really trying to find out how can we accelerate that process from start to end. So in terms of, if we differentiate between crops and microbes, in crops, we basically have two ways of looking at this. We can build a library that encompasses any genetic variation in one seed to seed cycle. That in the terms of lupins, that can be 5 months, can be 6 months. If you work with coffee, that's of course a different story. When it comes to actually identifying something in these libraries, that takes 6 to 8 weeks. In 6 to 8 weeks, once the library is established, we can find anything in these libraries and take them out again. So once we have established libraries, it's a really fast way to react to this. But I think it's also really important to understand, especially in a breeding concept when it comes to plants, you want to move with the elite lines. You want to be starting off. You don't want to be stuck with an old variety that you necessarily use over and over again. You want to be able to quickly start a new program in a new background, and then moving into seed-to-seed cycles is really disruptive. When it comes to microbes and the type of strains that Debbie is working with, here we're talking weeks. We typically, when we work in strain development programs for external collaborators, that is something that we do in 8 to 10 weeks, where we're basically getting a strain in and we can put something out like that. This is the type of timeframes you have now in a trait development space, where I think we went from months to weeks in the microbial space and from years to months in the crop space.
That is very impressive. Thank you, Tony. I'm going to stay with you and ask you more questions because the chat is quite active. I have a question from Ilaria. Tony, is it interesting for you to invest in the development of category 1 traits?
Is it interesting for us to invest into category 1 traits? There, I'm assuming category 1 traits is referencing towards Katja's
I believe, yes,
technology space and these kind of techniques. And there, in principle, the answer is no. We're gonna maintain a focus on non-GM and globally regulated non-GM techniques for now. This is something where we feel there's different tools for different things. What we want to really specialize on is utilizing tools that can be used in any kind of organism. So we love the idea that there's a tool set that we want to further develop to also work in under-resourced crops that are non-transformable from that point of view. And I think we want to give some love and care into these kind of organisms as well. And we want to develop the tools that will be at the forefront for these kind of niche crops as well. And there, I think we need to go towards these techniques that we have been using in a conventional point of view, because we don't have that genetic barrier in terms of transformability or recalcitrance when it comes to microbes.
Yeah, that is interesting. So this was for category 1 trait as described from Katja. We have another question, Tony. Sorry again, I'm going to have you back on stage. But so going back actually to your example and your case study around lupin, could you explain what now is the road to market of lupin with your sweet lupine gene? Sorry, lupine, not lupin. So who will turn this in an innovative product and run with it based on licensing IP, which I assume you share with the university? That's a question from Caroline.
This is a very specific question on the commercial model behind these things. And no, in principle, and from that point of view, this was a university collaboration that we participated in, and the IP belongs to the university and the people that work with that. So it's basically at the discretion of the people that develop that trait in that particular project to do with that lupin what they see fit. Of course, we see a standard commercialization route for these things. There's certain rules that you need to follow, even if you have IP or not IP. It's also up to them whether they want to protect this type of trait. We also in plans, we have variety registration, how you can protect something. And the key thing here for them is that they can go out with that plant and they can grow it in any environment without any regulatory restrictions. Great. They can do feeding trials without having any restrictions from a regulatory point of view in order to collect data. From a commercial point of view, now, of course, there's different options. They can use the plant that they have and move that trait into whatever variety they want to work with partners that they link up to. What it also shows is because we could do it in this specific variety, this trait can basically also move into any specific breeding pool by just doing it again from scratch. If you look at isolated breeding programs like Australia, breeding programs that really don't travel out of the country, it's very specific. You don't bring anything in, you create it from scratch. They can also start to discuss now where that specific trait can be created again in a germplasm that is just very close to the breeder's gene pool. So you maintain that flexibility. The commercial models behind that the owner of that IP needs to figure out. But there we see different models as well.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe 1 to 2 last questions. So I have one from Rosemary. Do you know if European Commission plan to discuss about the methods used for the introduction of foreign genes? Introducing one gene in a specific locus induces less mutations than random mutagenesis or breedings. Potentially Katja on this one.
Frankly speaking, I don't know, but I don't know precisely, but I hope they will, they have already, because it's not anymore into the hands of the European Commission. But I hope that during their assessment, their study, and the drafting of their proposal, they took into account the more scientific aspects of the introduction of external genes. So to the extent of my understanding and knowledge, the most difficult thing to assess in this situation is that definitely there could be some overlap between GMOs and some NGTs techniques because of the possible introduction of foreign genes and the way we introduce it. But I cannot explain more specifically because I'm a number lawyer and not a scientist. I'm sorry.
No, but it's already quite clear and very, very useful. So thank you so much.
Maybe a scientific view on this, if I can add my little thing to it as well, because this is the fascinating question that we are sitting in, and that's where technologies evolve in both senses. in this random mutagenesis is linear, the amount of mutations you can induce into a genome. And I think where it's now coming in to a space where we are able to basically also have plans in a random mutagenesis process where, in theory, it's one mutation that will be introduced into that plan. So that concept of what makes more or less mutations, I think technologies have evolved. We can have very clean gene-edited events. We can very clean transgenic events, but we can also have very clean plans coming from random mutagenesis events. That's not going to help the complexity of the regulatory framework, but it gives the people developing traits tools outside that framework.
Thanks for this input. Absolutely. I think it's very, very interesting for all of those to have those different opinions. And actually just viewpoints. It is 3 p.m. so on local time again, but we're right on time. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I saw a comment, also a question on the slides. Everyone who was registered will have access to the replay, and the replay will have the video and will have the slides. So to wrap up, I would really like to thank our panelists, Tony, Debbie, Katja, for your interventions and for your presentations. It was very interesting. It's a great way for everyone to decipher the main trends in trait development. And if you want to know more about those new technologies, you could either reach out to Tony, Debbie, or Katja, and you can as well, hopefully in the future, Hello Tomorrow, like I was presenting at the beginning, we have an upcoming global event in March called the Global Summit, where decision makers, startups, innovators will actually be brought together to discuss those topics and to potentially change things. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you again for the participants for your insights, and looking forward to speaking more potentially offline. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.